All right, welcome back, my friends. So in this subsector of videos, we are going to look at how we dispose of waste. We're going to kind of consider mostly the United States, but it could be thought of that these same practices are realistically being done all over the world. So, of course, in developing nations, maybe not in more developed nations, perhaps so. One can hope, fingers crossed, right? Beginning here, we're going to focus on the United States. And it turns out that we don't actually tend to take care of all of our waste here in our country. So we will dive into that idea. So essentially, there's roughly kind of like four main disposal methods. Dump it, bury it, burn it, or export it. So basically, like, what are we doing with this stuff? All of this stuff that we love to generate, and the waste in which of the stuff that we make and create and use, where does it go, right? So remember, it cannot be created or destroyed. It's just simply changed in matter. These are the traditional waste methods, of course, and I certainly do believe that we can do better. So in the next video, I'll talk about some of the ways in which we can indeed be better. But we gotta, of course, first step into some of these other disposal methods, starting with dump it. This concept of open dumps. So this is banned in most developed countries, right? But is still common in less developed countries because it seems to be cheap and easy, right? Especially if you're in a developing nation, you're constantly trying to look for things that are cheap because you are still trying to, be more developed, right? But of course, there are many external costs to open dumping related to pollution and health, right? Perhaps you know this, but dumps or landfills create methane and can create air pollution problems. They could also potentially leach into the groundwater, which then, of course, you are going to be drinking that water or breathing that air. It's pretty wild. So this particular picture here, this is from your book, but this is from the country of Cambodia, which is actually one of the, no, just kidding. I was thinking of another country. I was going to say the lowest on the totem pole in terms of recycling. But so this is a municipal garbage dump where people have gathered things like plastic, metals, wood, cloth, and paper, which they can sell to recyclers perhaps. But of course, again, this exposes the people to dangerous chemicals, air pollution, and disease, especially if you're someone like the one here shown that works in this industry, right? So you're basically, it's almost in a sense a method of environmental racism in a way, right? Because you're forcing people to work in this industry and be exposed to these chemicals. And then, of course, the one that's near and dear to my heart, not in a fun way, is ocean dumping. So, of course, this is officially banned worldwide. No one, I don't think anyone is like, let's throw our trash into the ocean, unless you're a cruise liner. And you love to do it because it's cheaper to do it that way than offload it onto your ports. Gotta love it. Yeah, cruise lines are horrendous for the environment. But trash does still get into the oceans, especially plastic. So how do you think perhaps it gets there, right? You could maybe even think like some of these smaller, lightweight plastics, if you're putting them into a landfill or perhaps into these open dumps, wind can take it away, right? So it can be kind of floating out into the ocean, or storm drains are a big way that a lot of trash gets into the oceans as well. Here in San Francisco, you don't really want to go swimming in the bay or in the surrounding waters after a big rain event because a lot of those chemicals are put into the waterways, which are dangerous for your skin to touch, things like that. And unfortunately, this is causing a lot of deaths in our marine animals. It can be birds, whales, fish, all these different kinds of animals are ingesting these plastics because they look like they're food, perhaps. Or marine birds in particular, and a specific subset of marine birds, they don't really have much of a sense of taste. So they're just eating whatever they see, right? And they may not know that it's plastic, so they'll feel full but have no nutrients. There's no nutritional value of ingesting plastic, right? So it's really, really bad down the line, especially if you're someone who eats seafood. You might be eating the plastic that the fish ends up eating. So what is being done about some of the ocean dumping? So what happens, and the reason that there's this photo here in the bottom left of the ocean gyres, there's these overall large circulations at the surface. So basically this trash kind of accumulates in the middle, and perhaps you've heard of something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Thankfully, there is a company out there that is working to clean up the garbage patch. It's a company called the Ocean Cleanup. It's by this gentleman, Boylan Slot, out of, I believe, Denmark. Definitely out of Europe. And so he's really trying to tackle this issue, and not necessarily for profit at all. His goal is for the company to be able to cease when they've done their job, basically. But it's hard because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the plastics are broken down plastics. They're microplastics. So it's not as easy necessarily as like going in and sweeping up all this trash at the surface, but that is what his company is trying to do. And also, not only is he trying to do it that way, but there's other ships called the interceptors where they are deployed at the mouths of rivers of very polluting regions. I think there's one in Los Angeles. There's one in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I think they're implementing one in Bangkok, Thailand as well. And I want to say Guatemala also, but I forget. I follow them on Instagram. And if you want something uplifting to follow them. And just to kind of keep track on what they're doing. Anyway, so that's getting the plastic before it has a chance to reach the oceans. So kind of a really cool concept there. So that's in the oceans, and I teach oceanography, so the oceans are very, very near and dear to me. So this is something that always makes me sad. Oh, also, last statistic that I saw with ocean pollution, perhaps about 25% of that are cigarette butts. So if you are someone that smokes, I highly encourage you to stop the habit of flicking your butt out into the streets, because that goes straight into the storm drains, which can then go straight into the oceans. So yay, make yourself a little bit better by breaking that habit. Another way that we can take care of our waste is by burying it. So this is looking at sanitary landfills. This is something perhaps that's out of sight, out of mind, right? So if we put all of our trash into a place that we don't see it, then we're not going to think about it, right? Who cares? Kind of like burying your head in the sand sort of idea. So over 60% of our MSW is compostable, and we bury it deep in the ground without oxygen, which makes it really difficult or impossible to degrade. And then though it can degrade by anaerobic bacteria. So that's bacteria that does not use oxygen, but this process is extraordinarily slow. And of course, methane gas is produced. And we don't like the methane gas situation because it's a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, which I'll actually talk about on the next slide. But thankfully, many landfills are no longer accepting yard waste. It has to be composted. So we're kind of taking away the yard trimmings portion of this MSW, which is kind of cool. So going a little bit further into these systems, composting systems, right? So aerobic bacteria helps decompose the waste and produces CO2 as a waste product. Still not great, but what's kind of neat with that is bacteria are like us, where they use aerobic respiration. So when you breathe out, you're breathing out a lot of CO2. And then in anaerobic landfills, that's where anaerobic bacteria called methanogens decompose the waste and produce methane as a waste product. Unfortunately, methane is very explosive and it is a very powerful greenhouse gas, so landfills have to develop systems in order to collect as much of that gas as possible. And thankfully, there is a small but growing number of landfills that collect this gas and burn it to generate electricity. So it's more of like a circular sort of system, which is something that I believe to be rather important. Then looking at landfill design here, so this is a graphic from your book, which shows some of the landfill design requirements. And I encourage you to check out the EPA website and the next slide for more details. So I also encourage you to maybe pause the video or study this graphic nicely in your book. So here's another sort of sanitary landfill design here. There's two different figures, so I very much encourage you to check out both diagrams, see how this process works, and really drive in this idea that it's not just simply an open dump, right? There are more steps and processes to this. But even well-designed landfills can produce things called leachate, probably not saying that right, but here we are, methane. But also landfills can sometimes leak, they're filling up, and they're very difficult to site, and they can't take all waste, mainly hazardous waste, right? And that's something that we're still continuously working to improve. So hazardous waste, speaking of, is any discarded liquid or solid that threatens human health or the environment. These are some of the hazardous waste tends to possess some sort of ignitability, so a flash point below 60 degrees Celsius, corrosivity, so it breaks down like corrosive, kind of rusts in a way, reactivity, and toxicity, so is it fatal, carcinogenic, mutagenic in low doses, etc. So electronic waste is an example here as well, or even things like batteries, right? So we have to properly dispose of batteries. Lithium is extraordinarily explosive, so do not throw your batteries away in the trash because they can light on fire. And as fun as that is to have a whole landfill be on fire, probably not so much. Another way of getting rid of our waste is by burning it through incineration. So a lot of our municipal solid waste is burnable. Incineration reduces the volume of waste from 80 to 90%. So that's great. So instead of having this big old pile, it shrinks it down a bit. And many incinerators actually use that heat that's generated to help them generate electricity. So that's kind of cool, right? Again, it's in this sort of circular sort of pattern here. However, there's a big but here, right? So air pollution concerns include CO2, particulates, heavy metals, and dioxins, right? So the smoke basically can consist of these things. The product then, of course, is also hazardous waste. So ash is hazardous waste here, and it can't go into a sanitary landfill. And of course, also siting new incinerators is pretty difficult, and construction of them can be expensive. And so this is a diagram from your book. It's kind of cut off a little bit in the PowerPoint slide, so apologies for that. But definitely take a look at infographic 5 in your book. But you can see here this sort of circular kind of motion here, where we dump trash into the bunker. It's transferred, into the combustion chamber, where it's then burned, where then it heats up the boiler, which then can boil that water and steam into a turbine, which then can generate electricity. Woohoo, that's fantastic. And then flue gases go through filters to remove some contaminants, but then the remaining material is released from the smokestack, which of course may still contain pollutants. And this can also go into this idea that I mentioned before about environmental racism. So if a lot of low-income neighborhoods, unfortunately, are generally around factories, so this could be an example of a sort of factory that low-income folks can only afford to live by. And there's increasing rates of health issues that come about by living around these areas where the air is being polluted. So kind of wild, I think. Then last thing that we can do with our trash is export it. We can say, hey, listen, not our problem anymore, right? So do we do this? We certainly do, unfortunately. Some folks call it garbage imperialism in a sense. So we tend to export to nations that have few economic options and often less regulations. So then they are the ones that actually end up having to deal with the health impacts and the pollution, right? So not great. Instead of us, right? It's like, oh, I don't want to be impacted by pollution, so I'm going to give it off to somebody else. Generally not excellent, right? And then within the United States and the poorer states and Native American lands are often targeted, as I basically mentioned before. And then our recyclables and e-waste is often exported as well. So how much of that can actually get recycled? And then what conditions exist for those who are doing the recycling. So I got this image here for San Francisco's recyclable commodities from June 2023 to November 2023. So just a small subset, right, of time period. But you can see that we are not the only ones that are taking in our recyclables. Asia's taking a lot of them, right? What's also really interesting, if you read up on the SF municipal website, so you can like see what's good for recycling, what's not good for recycling. There's something, it's really fascinating. Like your recyclables have to be clean and clear of food and bulk materials, and they can't be saturated with oils, which is actually one of the reasons why you can't recycle pizza boxes, because they tend to have oil seeped within that. So kind of interesting, I think. And this is just San Francisco, right? And it's just for like a June, July, August, September, October. It was like a 6 month period, right? So it's not encapsulating everything, but it's still very interesting, I think. So last thing here is looking at what we would like to do and what we were actually doing, right? So what we would like to do, of course, would be to reduce and reuse, recycle and compost, and incinerate with energy capture, and then lastly, incinerate or landfill without energy capture. But in fact, that is not what we are actually doing. So it's almost kind of like a wishful thinking sort of thing. But in the next set of videos, we will look into further some things that we can do to shrink our waste that we create. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed.